are we actually paying patients enough? And if not, which I would argue most people would say we're not,
Yeah.
are there legitimately compliant ways to pay patients more? Hi there, Edye and Darshan again, back yet again for another episode of our wonderful series, Different Roles, Shared Goals. And what we wanted to focus and talk about in this particular session is whether or not we should be paying trial participants more and compensating them in different ways currently in clinical trials. And I want to set the stage for this because, of course, the first thing everyone goes to is coercion, right? And the issue of would the IRB approve this, and thus would the FDA approve this? And this really, when we began talking about the concept of coercion, was much more about, first of all, things like individuals who were unfortunately prisoners in Holocaust camps and were experimented upon, right? So the level of coercion there is they were arrested and they were under complete confinement. That then graduated to the concept of coercion in that you're telling individuals who would not otherwise have access to the information or the capacity to understand that this is their only option for care. This is their only treatment. You're guaranteeing benefits that you can't actually guarantee. You're lying to them. Okay. And we also know the number one reason across the entire world, all types of trials, all types of demographics, that clinical trials fail is lack of patient recruitment. So this brings us to this question of, are there ways we could compensate more without, of course, violating coercion? And especially given, are we accounting for things like the current financial situation in the United States, higher layoffs, potential tariffs, right? Is there a market value to compensation? Darshan?
So you come at it, as you can tell, from a patient perspective, but from the site recruitment retention perspective, which I totally get, totally
Yeah.
valid. I'm going to take a slightly different perspective. Sites, as you've pointed out in the previous conversations we've had, don't have a bullseye right on them. On the other hand, sponsors very much do. CROs less so, but sponsors very much do. You pointed out, for example, coercion as being the primary reason, and it absolutely is one of them. However, I think that's a regulatory reason. There's another one, which is beneficiary inducement. There are beneficiary inducement statutes that are separate from the coercion statutes building from the FD&C Act. And in those specific ones, you cannot induce certain patients to use certain products, for example, by paying them too much. And that may very well be what you're looking at in these scenarios. There have been lawsuits and penalties that go
But
along with it.
does that apply to the clinical trials jurisdiction?
It
Like what you're talking
should.
about is 100% accurate. I know what you're talking about, but I'm saying, and how is, so take the example. So the trial I was just talking about was done by a global CRO with a lot of pharmaceutical sponsor support, and it was very, very successful, right? In that scenario, I'm looking at it and going, okay, the muffins and juice that they get when they get done with their testing that they probably didn't even realize they were going to get is not an inducement to use any product at that point, right? Like that's just I would like to be kind and take care of you. Now, if it was like, you know, we're giving you an obscene amount of money and everything's branded with the drug name on it, and like I feel like there's some other ways you could go down this road and get there. I'm just trying to think of an example of what you're talking about. So
So
what would be an example of that, right? What is patient-centered design in a protocol that was intended well, but then makes it to where you're talking about that's beneficiary inducement?
So what I'm pointing out is a slightly different point. I think from a beneficiary inducement standpoint, it absolutely does apply. And I can see lawyers, it doesn't take that much of a stretch to point it out. Is any lawyer in their right mind going to bring a jury trial where you go, you gave them muffins, therefore you induced someone? You'd have to be ridiculous. You'd get
I mean, if
laughed
they
out of
were
court.
Nutella muffins from France, it could get ugly.
But yeah, I mean, the point is, I went to a conference recently where I saw large sites. I'm not talking about massive sites, but site networks who said that what we do is the way we recruit is we go to low income communities and we tell them, you will never get this healthcare. We'd like to do preventative testing. We'd like to do this type of review on your healthcare. You'll never get it. We're just doing it for the community. And you're giving things of value to the community. And everyone in attendance were like, that's a great idea. We should all do it. What not realizing that that is a payment being made by the site to patients so that they participate in these clinical trials.
Right.
Whether that's coercive or an inducement, especially if you start tying it to XYZ study, this is happening today.
But what about, I mean, like I'm thinking about it from the perspective of the sponsor and the CRO here, where they're placing whatever this is in the protocol and they're passing it down to the site.
What is the? I'm sorry, I don't fully understand. Placing
So like
this.
the muffin concept, right,
No,
is something
I
that's
think no
like,
one's going to argue muffins.
I
I
know,
think
I'm
that's
just
easy.
using it as the sponsor and the CRO placed it in there. So why is, if for example, the sponsor does want you, if the site themselves wants to go out and do advocacy in their community, there's nothing wrong with that. I want to be clear. We're not saying that's a bad thing of in
Advocacy is
itself.
fine.
Advocacy is absolutely fine. If, however, as a part of the trial, you're consenting and saying, this is how you will.
Not even necessarily
I,
part of the trial.
I'm trying to follow this only because I feel like there's such a minute chance of this happening, and I don't understand
No,
how it would apply to this.
I think it's a very high chance of it happening. I think the
But
moment you
that's
say
what I'm
that
trying to get is what is an example of it happening? Like what's,
the site in this scenario.
but that's
Um,
not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about stuff that comes from the sponsor.
I get that. I get that. I'm going to work
Okay,
to it. I
okay.
appreciate that. The site is being paid by the sponsor in the end, whether it's for this study or
Sure.
overall.
Sure.
The site lands up being a pass-through entity in these scenarios.
Sure.
So you now have a scenario where certain sponsors are paying through the site a bunch of money to patients and being told, you will only get it because of this sponsor and if you participate in these studies. And that's why you will not get this healthcare otherwise. Healthcare, you are either an illegal immigrant or you don't have the money.
Okay. Now I know where we are. Okay. So I don't disagree with you in that particular situation, but I do want to make very clear to our audience that that is like the North Pole and the South Pole talking here, right? So
Absolutely.
like
But it's
the muffins example is one very, very different end of the spectrum than what you're talking about, which was a clear bad actor.
no, but that's
And
the thing. It was very normalized in the conversation we had. It was very clear that this was not one bad actor. There were dozens and scores of them. And that's
okay.
what surprised me. That's why I was like, we need to have this conversation.
Enjoying our content? We'd love to hear more. Please like, share, comment, and find more on our website. Let's give the audience something practical to work with as opposed to just all the scary things that they can't do. Are we actually paying patients enough? And if not, which I would argue most people would say we're not,
Yeah,
are there legitimately compliant ways to pay patients more?
fair enough.
So the muffins is obviously a, PG
Right.
example, right? Like a very 101 example. Where can we go from the muffin example before we get anywhere close to the Baba Gaya example, right, of badness? But how do we take that good intention and build on it a little bit and create a bit newer standard? Because you and I both know this standard changes. Like we were just saying at the beginning, what was coercion 15 years ago, or the price that would be, approved, or whether or not hotel or travel was approved 30 years ago versus 15 years ago versus 5 years ago, completely different concepts, especially at the IRB level, what they feel comfortable, because there's not, an exact amount written down in the rules for coercion. So where can we push that envelope in a positive way?
To me, I think a really good way to think about it is how you pay and again, this is not legal advice, just to be clear, but a good starting point, if I was a sponsor, if I was the compliance team, I'd start thinking about is how do you pay an investigator? You're not paying them for now in the case of investigators, you're paying them for their expertise. Let's respect that in this case, this is not expertise you're paying for. You're paying for access.
Mm-hmm.
In which case, the cost of access has to be reasonable cost defrayment. Does not have to be individual to individual. So just because a doctor joins up for a clinical trial doesn't mean he or she gets paid differently than someone who's a fast food worker. However, there has to be a reasonable amount. Not the doctor who signs up doesn't get to stay in the Four Seasons, while the fast food worker has to go stay at motel whatever 7, 6, whatever it is. You have to say this is what we consider to be overall compliant. And that might be,
Yeah.
you know what, everyone gets the Marriott, and I'm making this up.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
In the same way, this is where the conversation starts. In the same way, we're going to pay people X amount of money to participate. That can result in one of two different answers. Does everyone get paid minimum wage? No, almost no one participates in these trials at minimum wage. Maybe we need to pay a decent amount of money. Well, what does decent mean? Maybe you tie that to the average amount paid in that state. I'm making up a number.
Mhm.
Does that induce too many people? I would be hard pressed from a compliance perspective to argue that someone being paid $10 an hour instead of $7 an hour is inducement. However,
Right.
someone being paid $50 an hour instead of $12 an hour is
Well,
much
and
more
this is
further gone.
where I think you go back to, as we've talked about in other series topics, this is where we're assigning these numbers, these magical, magical numbers that are game changers for people like the sites or maybe even the participants as to whether or not they're going to participate, as to whether or not they can take the trial on, as to whether or not they'll be successful, as to whether or not they can navigate the margins, whatever it might be. And to be fair, what the individuals setting this number are at, right? Whether you're the sponsor, the CRO, or the IRB trying to, decide if you think what they've proposed is reasonable, is a bit of a guessing game and is not always, unfortunately, and it's not intentional, I don't think. It's just, the way we've always done it, is not always 100% rooted in science. So right there, you were already doing a great analysis where you're getting down to, a jurisdiction, an average wage, an average cost of living based on the demographic of an area. Those are at least data points that we're using to calculate and say, what is the average person? I have to go average. I can't go low. I can't go high. What is the average person going to be losing in a day of work? What is the average person going to be looking at for compensation? And at least begin having a really meaningful conversation about that. What I see happening is quite the reverse. I see precedent and database information being set from the sponsor and CRO level going, well, we got this approved at this IRB. These guys let us do it for this much. Right. And I'm not saying that's like nefarious on the part of the sponsor. I'm just saying that's the benchmarker that they're using, as opposed to going in and saying, this is the up to date, real time, data around this particular population or demographic, I should say, of where we would like to conduct these trials and what we believe is fair. And then if you have documented data like that to represent why your compensation model works a certain way, that also, what folks don't realize is that also gives the IRB rationale.
Find related podcasts below.
So I have two separate comments on that. One is, for lack of a better term, calling out sponsors, and the second one is calling out sites. And I think that's how we try to approach this. This series is about,
Yep. Seeing it from all the different.
Exactly. So from the sponsors, I'll start with the sponsors because I lined up working with a lot of sponsors. I've had sponsors in some scenarios go, you know what? I'm going to pay the absolute minimum I have to. You go, why? Well, it's a chemotherapy trial. There are no other options for this treatment, and because I can. And that, I think, is a problem. You don't pay a patient the lowest amount you possibly can. That's not the point of a compensation. You're then just going, yeah, that's a bully, and that needs to stop. On the other hand, you have sites. And sites, I'm talking less about the larger AMCs. I'm talking more about the smaller for-profit sites right now who go, I'm trying to meet a certain, and I'm not talking about all of them. I have some wonderful sites I work with who are incredible. But some sites will go, I need to be able to recruit patients. The more money I put into their pockets, the more likely they are to participate in the study. So as much money as you can give me, that's a little bit less than what I need to recruit. And that, neither one of those two standards is appropriate.
No.
And I think sites and sponsors should be called out for exactly that comment.
I think that's why I keep gravitating towards some data-based model, right? That's objective, that's clear, that's based on standards that we employ and use in several other industries. It's exactly how like your travel reimbursement if you work for a government agency is determined.
I love it. Edye, thank you again for coming on.
Always.
Call, click, or email.